Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jackie Lopez. I'm a program manager with the New York City chapter of the Alzheimer's Association. Happy Women's History Month. We're incredibly excited to have everyone here with us today for a special program on the latest in Alzheimer's and dementia research. I do want to mention if there is anyone who is viewing this as a recording, please note that the information that we are presenting today is the latest information as of March 20th. We encourage you to please visit our website, alz.org, to view the latest in research and the science behind Alzheimer's and dementia. So now, without further ado, it is my great honor to present Mrs. Meg Boyce. So Mrs. Boyce received her Master's of Social Work from Fordham University in 1995. From 1995 until 2000, Meg worked in the long-term care field as a director of social work for 2 nursing facilities in Dutchess County. In 2000, she joined the Hudson Valley Chapter of the Alzheimer's Association as a program director and was promoted to vice president of programs and services in 2013. In this role, she oversees the programs and services that are offered by the chapter in order to meet the needs of the community the chapter serves. Meg played an integral part in opening the first unit in the country for inmates with Alzheimer's disease or related dementia. She also provided a web-based training that reaches police officers throughout the state of New York and was involved in the development of a webcast that provided awareness and education to the medical professionals about the underdiagnosis and misdiagnosis of diverse populations who are at higher risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. Meg is our beloved research champion here at the Alzheimer's Association. So without further ado, I'm going to hand off to Meg.
Thank you so much, Jackie, for that sweet introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. Happy Women's Month. And yes, I will be focusing on women and why we're at a higher risk. So this presentation is slightly different than the other presentations that I do because we will be spending a little more time in that area. Before I get started, I always put a disclaimer out there that I am not a researcher, I'm not a doctor, not a scientist. I am a social worker with a special passion, interest in the research fields. I've been in the field for almost 30 years, 24 years at the Alzheimer's Association. So I've watched research ebb and flow over time. And so I'm going to jump right in. So our time today, I'll touch on Alzheimer's and dementia science, focus on a little bit of the highlights of the importance of early detection and diagnosis, focusing on women as well, talking about the latest advances in clinical trials and treatments, and then also how you can get involved. And we will have time at the end for Q&A. And again, just put any questions you have in the chat feature, and Jackie will get to those once we are done with the presentation. So I always start off with this slide because the years that I've been here, I think this is the question I still get asked often. What's the difference between Alzheimer's and dementia? Dementia is not a diagnosis. So dementia is an umbrella term used to describe a range of symptoms that are associated with cognitive impairment. Now, sometimes the very first symptoms aren't even cognitive issues. Sometimes families see changes in mood and personality. Sometimes dementia is reversible. The importance of early detection and diagnosis is why we push that, because it is reversible. The reason Alzheimer's and dementia have a tendency to get intermingled is because Alzheimer's disease is 60 to 80% of all dementias, with the next most prevalent being vascular dementia. And then you can also see we have the Lewy body and the frontal temporal dementia. And I always say, when someone who is known to us on the celebrity arena is diagnosed with one form of dementia, we hear more about it. And because of Bruce Willis and Wendy Williams, we're definitely hearing a lot more, and our communities are learning a lot more about frontal temporal dementia. So what researchers have come to realize is that Alzheimer's disease is actually on a continuum. Pretty surprising to hear that the plaques and tangles that develop in our brain, which I'll be touching on, that are in relation to Alzheimer's disease, actually begins in our brains 20 to 30 years before onset of symptoms. So I am standing here today, speaking to you, and I could very well have the plaques and tangles in my brain, but I don't know it yet because I'm not showing the symptoms. If I start to develop symptoms, I may go to my doctor. Well, I would go to my doctor and really advocate to have proper testing done. And if I am diagnosed with mild cognitive impairment, which is dementia that is even before the early stages of Alzheimer's, it's kind of tricky to diagnose because it is so mild. But if I was diagnosed with mild cognitive impairment, also known as MCI, um, and it is of the Alzheimer's type, then I would continue to progress through the disease continuum. So, what actually happens in the brain when it comes to Alzheimer's specifically? There are three hallmarks of the disease. The first is a neuritic plaque. So, it's a sticky plaque that is developed in the brain from a protein called beta amyloid. Now, we all have beta amyloid protein in our brains. People with Alzheimer's disease have a tendency to have more of it than should be normal. And this neuritic plaque actually builds on the outside of our brain cell or our neuron, and it impacts that brain cell ability to communicate with another brain cell. The second hallmark is called a neurofibrillary tangle. This is developed by a protein in our brains that we all have, but people with Alzheimer's have more of it, called tau. And this protein actually gets inside the brain cell, and that is what kills the brain cell over time. And the third is neurodegeneration, also known as cortical atrophy. So you can see from these slides, this is actual footage of brain matter. The healthy brain is very full, has lots of brain matter. The advanced Alzheimer's brain does not have as much brain matter to it. It has shrunk in size. But there's also areas that you can see that have been greatly impacted where there is no more brain matter to be had. So something else that researchers have been keeping an eye on, so we've had researchers, of course, looking at medication-based, but in the past 5-7 years, there have been a whole group of researchers that now are looking into modifiable risk factors. So, are there things that we can do in our life that may change the trajectory? I'll start off with our non modifiable risk factors. So, age is the largest risk factor for developing Alzheimer's. Genetics, we can't choose who our parents are. So, if we are at a higher genetic rate for developing the disease, there are also differences in that race and ethnicity, as well as sex and gender. With that being said, there is actually a lot that we can do that will actually change the trajectory of the disease, which we are doing more research on. So we can definitively say, yes, if you do these things, we can't say that just yet. But these are just some of the areas that are being researched. So things such as level of education, which I'll be talking about later, traumatic brain injury, physical activity. We know how important physical activity is for the brain. That is connected also to cardiovascular health. So our hearts and our brains are very closely connected. So every time our hearts beat, 25% of the blood goes to the brain. So we have to make sure that our hearts are at highest level of functioning. Sleep is a big one. They actually had the very first dementia prevention conference. The CDC, Centers for Disease Control, along with the Alzheimer's Association last June. And there were a number of presentations on sleep and the importance of sleep, not only the amount of sleep that we get, but the type of sleep that we get. Diet also is another big one. Lots of talk about how ultra processed foods can impact our brain health and trying to eat a clean, healthy diet. Cognitive and social engagement, this actually really came to the forefront during the pandemic. We learned very quickly how isolation can really increase dementia or increase the signs or symptoms that family members see of loved ones who've already been diagnosed. And also our environmental. So is it something that we're breathing? Is it something in the air? Is it something that we've lived by? So all of these things are being researched. It is just the tip of the iceberg. There are many other probable causes that develop Alzheimer's disease, but these are the main ones that are being reviewed at the moment. So when we really think about the, the development of the disease, and we look at all of this, it could very well be very individualized as to why somebody might develop the disease. So there definitely is more research that's being done. We actually have a study. Oops, I thought it was on the next slide. We actually have a study that will have the results in 2025. That's called the US Pointer Study that actually looked at all of these variables and will determine what can we do to truly keep our brains as healthy as possible. So now we're going to focus more on the reason why you're all here. First of all, the gender. So almost 2/3 of Americans with Alzheimer's are women. And we'll be talking a little bit, well, actually a lot more about that. I think it's also important to know that Black African Americans are twice as likely to develop Alzheimer's, and Hispanic Latinos are 1.5 times more likely. Research is looking into the possibility of other chronic diseases that would put them at a higher risk. And then also, ethno-racial groups have been historically underrepresented in clinical studies. And this really underscores the importance and the need for more diversity in our dementia research. We want to make sure that the research that we are doing is going to help every single community. And the only way we will know that is if we have individuals from every single community involved in clinical trials. But let's get down to the business of women. Why are we at a higher risk? Women and Alzheimer's. While the reason for this striking discrepancy isn't yet known, proposed theories range from differences in healthcare usage to lifestyle factors to lifespan and other biological variations. The first area I'm going to talk about are in regards to sex-specific differences. The thought used to be that because women lived longer, we were at a higher risk for developing Alzheimer's. And that may be partially true, but that can't be the whole reason. So there was a study that looked at the span of the female reproductive period. So there was a researcher that looked at the age of when a young woman, experiences their first menstrual period, the age at which they are impacted by menopause, and the time between that first menstruation and menopause. And while more research is needed, this study supports a promising theory that there could very well be the reasoning of all of the hormonal changes that a woman's body goes through that a male's body does not go through, that could be a potential reason for us being at a higher risk. There's also research looking into sex differences in the architecture of the brain. So, does a woman's brain actually look and act like a man's brain? And scientists have found that there are differences in actual structural and functional connections of a woman's brain that may actually speed the spread of tau. So if you remember earlier, I talked about tau being one of the proteins in our brain, that if we have too much of that in our brain, it will impact our ability to function, and it will impact our cognitive ability. So does a woman's brain, because of how it is laid out differently than a man's brain, actually speed up the spread of tau? So these findings could lead to the creation of a risk reduction strategy targeted to women once we have more information. So that is more of the sex-specific differences. So it's interesting, you look at that statistic I showed you, and it talked about in America, women are two-thirds more likely. So most studies in the US, again, women are at a higher risk. But what's interesting is there have been studies done in other parts of this world where it wasn't necessarily the same outcome. So, is there something geographically that could be impacting women differently than men? So, for example, there have been some European studies that have reported a higher incidence among women at older ages. But then there was a study done out of the UK that reported higher incidences in men. So therefore, the differences may depend in part on not only that age, but that geographic location. So why is it that women are at a higher risk in some parts of the world and men are at a higher risk in other parts of the world? And I'm sure those researchers that have done that type of research will come together and hopefully shed some more light on that. The third area is level of education. So you saw this as a modifiable risk factor. There have been several studies that have looked at the level of education that somebody had and what their incident rate of Alzheimer's is. And the more education, the lower the risk. So gender differences may exist in the distribution of or even the effect known risk factors for dementia, such as education, occupation, and health behaviors. So for example, when you think about the folks now in their 70s, 80s, maybe even 60s, lower education attainment in women than in men in the first half of the 20th century may actually contribute to the elevated risk in women, as limited formal education is a risk factor for dementia. So, more men went to college, went on to grad schools. Women, they would go to college and then, most were stay-at-home moms. And so that is changing. And so now that women are more involved in the workforce, it'll be interesting to see if there will be a change in these numbers that we're seeing here in the US as far as the prevalence of Alzheimer's disease in individuals with women. This goes hand in hand with the next topic, which was occupational attainment. So other societal gender differences may be at play, such as differences in occupational attainment between men and women, with a recent study showing that women who participated in the paid workforce earlier in life had a better cognitive outcome after age 60 than women who were not part of the paid workforce. So that level of education, along with occupational attainment, excuse me, also kind of opens our eyes up to another potential reason as to why. And the last, and probably the one that's gotten the most research, is in regards to genetics and APOE4. So a number of studies have indicated that the APOE4 genotype, which is the best known common genetic risk factor for Alzheimer's dementia, actually may have a stronger association with Alzheimer's dementia and neurodegeneration in men than in women. APOE4 was related to higher Alzheimer's risk in women than in men between the ages of 55 to 70, when APOE4 is thought to exert its largest effects. So it's unclear whether the influence of APOE4 may depend on the sex hormone estrogen. So again, is there something in a woman's body that is triggering the APOE4 that we don't find in a man's body? And this, they're still trying to do some research on. Is there the correlation? Is that why APOE4 is a higher risk because of estrogen? And there was a professor based out of USC, Christian Pike, and I just wanted to quote him on what he learned in his research. So he focused on this genetic component, this APOE4, and the impact on women. And what he says, excuse me, in women, Alzheimer's disease risk is increased approximately 4 times with one copy of the gene and 10 times with 2 copies of the APOE4 gene, whereas men show essentially no increased risk with one APOE4 gene and only a 4-fold increased risk with 2 copies of the APOE4. So even in the absence of dementia, APOE4 is associated with significantly increased atrophy and dysfunction of the brain, and that affects women much more strongly than men. So even without dementia, having this increased APOE4 can really have some negative impacts on the brain. So when we take a step back and we look at women and the impact that Alzheimer's has, and we are also the caregivers, the percentage of women that are caregivers is quite high. So this disease impacts us in many different ways, both as caregivers, but as people who are at an increased risk. And with all of the areas that I just spoke about, I think it's a number of areas that are going to come out as to why. So nobody really no one's ever come forward and said, because of this, that's why women are at higher risk. We have all this research that's being done that's looking at all of these different areas that actually may be the answers to those questions. So why the importance of early detection and diagnosis? Again, the emotional, social, and medical benefits. It's really important for us to know much early on what is actually happening in our bodies. It will help us better understand symptoms. Like I said earlier, there are reversible forms of dementia. So things such as an undiagnosed diabetic, a severe urinary tract infection, which I think women are at a higher risk for than men, and also vitamin B12 deficiencies. So there are a list of reversible forms of dementia. So it really gives the family, the person concerned, the ability to better understand symptoms, to explore appropriate treatments. We want to make sure that we're not giving somebody a medication that's not going to help them because that's not the diagnosis they have. Also to improve health outcomes. So going back to those modifiable risk factors, what can I do if I go to my doctor and he says, you are now a diabetic? I know I'm going to make changes. I'm going to look at my diet. I'm going to look at my exercise. I'm going to even look at my sleep and make sure that I'm taking better care of myself. It prevents complications from being put on the wrong treatments. It also gives family members just that time to get all of their ducks in a row and let that individual be a part of those conversations. So like I said earlier, now that we know this disease is in our brains 20 to 30 years before onset of symptoms, we are now looking more at biomarkers. What can we do? How can we find out earlier on that somebody may be at risk? And there's 3 areas, and we really talk about biomarkers being the game changers, because if we can determine somebody has the disease before onset of symptoms, what could we do to potentially change that trajectory moving forward? So improvements in brain imaging, specifically PET scans, which I'll talk about, biofluid analysis, that blood-based biomarker we're all waiting for. And then things even like eye tests. There could be a test that your optometrist gives you at your annual that actually is something might pop up as a red flag that there might be cognitive issues. So there is a lot happening right now in the research arena that's looking at these biomarkers. So like I said earlier, the PET scans, the positron emission tomography, this gives the best picture of the brain. There's actually an agent that passes through the blood-brain barrier and attaches itself to the plaques and tangles in the brain. And the PET scan then is able to pick that up. PET scans will be required for the new treatments. And we want to thank Medicare for being proactive, even though it took a couple pushes to get them to be proactive. But just so that you know, Medicare would only cover 1 PET scan per lifetime. And with these new treatments that we have available, PET scans are going to be a requirement. And so Medicare has changed their guidelines. They are requiring more than 1 PET scan as long as there's the proper coding and that they know that it is for these particular treatments that the person is receiving the PET scan. It also helps exclude the diagnosis of Alzheimer's. So there have been people who were given a diagnosis of Alzheimer's, then they had a PET scan, and the PET scan did not show any plaques or tangles in the brain. And then it was working with the physicians to determine, okay, it's not Alzheimer's, what is it? And they can then get a better picture utilizing the scan. We're actually in a second study for PET scans. We're trying to reach more of the underrepresented communities. This PET scan really focuses on the underrepresented communities to make sure that these scans are not only beneficial for the Caucasian community, but the scans are beneficial for everyone. And then the next step is we want to make sure that they're available to all. We also are in a new era of diagnosis, of diagnostic tools. We now have an FDA-approved cerebral spinal fluid test that's on the market for Alzheimer's. yes, it sounds invasive. It's for those of you who have had children and need an epidural. That's what that is. So basically an epidural, but it will assess the amount of beta amyloid and tau in the person's cerebral spinal fluid in order to assist in the diagnosis. Now, we do have 3 emerging amyloid blood tests on the market. Right now, the blood tests are only approved by the FDA to be used in clinical trials. So we're getting more data on the efficacy of the blood tests. I will just throw a little disclaimer in there. If anybody is pushing a blood test now, it's not FDA approved. I bring that up because I know of a lab that is pushing an Alzheimer's blood test, but I think it's important for folks to know if you see anything about a blood test now out there on the market, it is not FDA approved, and therefore we don't know the efficacy of that test. We are hoping in the next 2 years that we will have a blood test that will be approved and available to all. And I'm talking futuristically, like 10 years down the road, if not more. The hope is if I go to my doctor and like we get our we get our cholesterol tested in our liver and our kidney function, and you get that whole panel, is there the hope that we will have at some point on that panel a blood test to see if we're at risk for Alzheimer's? And then what can we do? Like, can we look at our modifiable risk factors? Or could there be a treatment that we could use now that would then really change the trajectory of us developing the disease? But that's down the road quite a bit. So when we talk about focusing on risk reduction, we're really talking about those things that I brought up as far as modifiable risk factors. So the physical activity, the healthy diet, the social stimulation, and researchers are saying that up to 40% of dementia cases could be prevented or delayed if we target those modifiable risk factors. And here's the US Pointer study that I talked about earlier. It was a 2-year study. The results will be available hopefully early next year. We just had the last of, well, it's been a while now, probably about a year ago, we had the last of the 2000th participant. The folks that were in this study already were at risk for cognitive decline. So either they had mild cognitive impairment or they have the familial type of Alzheimer's in their family. And they wanted to see if making these modifiable, these lifestyle changes would actually change their trajectory of developing the disease. And this particular study looked at physical activity, nutrition, intellectual engagement, and health coaching. And the health coaching was for the structured group, and then there was a self-guided group. And as you can see from this slide, several small arms have broken off of here. So that lower right area, the National Institutes on Aging now are supporting some ancillary studies, one looking at neuroimaging, another that's focusing on sleep, neurovascular health, and then microbiome. So now we have researchers, excuse me. Now we have researchers that are looking at gut health and how is our gut health impacting our brain health. So researchers really have kind of opened the door. They're looking at so many different variables. And the US Pointer study is happening actually all over the world. It's actually called the World Fingers study. So it is happening everywhere, with the Alzheimer's Association kind of being the overseer. And so when we pull all this data together and it's released next year, we're going to have a lot of data that's going to help us in being able to say, if you do this, this, and this, yes, you will change the trajectory of developing the disease. So it will be a very exciting time. So on to the treatments. Okay, this screen looks a little different. Sorry, I was thrown off for a minute. Usually there's a bottom half to this, and I'm not quite sure where it went. But I know the information, so I will share it. So we've had treatments that started in 1996. There was actually one before that called Cognex, also known as Tacrin, but that was released from being utilized because of the side effects. And so we've had the Aricept, Exelon, Razidine, Namenda, and Nemzaric. All of these treat the symptoms, but they do not change the progression of the disease. So it does not modify or slow the progression. And the Aricept and Exelon, Aricept is FDA approved for people in the early to moderate stages, and the same with Exelon. Razidine and Namenda are approved for people more in the moderate to late stages. And then Namzaric is actually a combination of Namenda and Aricept. And that's approved also for moderate to late stage. And then we have the very first target amyloid treatment called Aduhelm that was approved in 2021, which now is going to be taken off the market. So just like Cognex and Tacrin, usually the first generation of an FDA-approved treatment is utilized. They gather more data. They determine its safety and its efficacy. And we know that Aduhelm was quite controversial to begin with, but it opened the door for now other treatments similar to get approved. So then we had Leqembi approved. Now, when you look at these pictures, you'll see that the amyloid target, so basically what these treatments do, the newer treatments, is a pass through the blood-brain barrier. They attach to the beta amyloid plaque and actually break the plaque away. They get rid of the plaque. I'm going to go to the next slide because I know the next slide has. And we actually have a new one, donanemab, coming down the pipeline. We were hoping it would be approved by now. The FDA wants to have one more meeting with some experts in the field before moving forward. But again, it's the same, it's in the same group. So these treatments attack the beta amyloid protein and get rid of it. You're probably asking, well, what about the tau? Well, it's important to know that we are actually supporting and funding over 140 unique therapies. So not only the beta amyloids, but we're also looking at the tau. Probably what will happen is a treatment will be similar to a treatment for someone who has cancer. So usually when someone's diagnosed with a type of cancer, they're put on chemo and radiation. That will probably be the same situation for someone with Alzheimer's. So they'll be put on a treatment to get rid of the beta amyloid plaque, and then they'll be put on a treatment to get rid of tau. These research studies are happening right now. There's actually a research study happening now with Leqembi and a tau treatment that actually is going to get rid of the tau to try to actually eradicate the disease from the brain. So it's a very exciting time. We're also looking at neuroinflammation and vascular stress. oxidative stress, cellular communication. There's just so much happening right now in the research field and the research arena. I'm just keeping track of my time. Okay. So how can you get involved? As a woman, I find it's very important to be a part of change, to be a part of finding what that cure is going to be, or that way of preventing the disease. And I hope you all agree with me on that. So I went on to our trial match. Probably it's been 4 years now. And I went through the questions. So you can go to alz.org/trial match, or you can click on the QR code there at the bottom. And what trial match is, it's a database. And in that database is, first of all, a profile of everybody who's interested in clinical trials, but then also every single clinical trial that's out there that's looking for participants. So you go on, you answer, I can't remember, 7 or 8 different questions, and then all of the research studies that you're eligible for will pop up. Once you see the studies that you're eligible for, you can kind of review them, read them, and if you're interested in one, you click on it and you send an email to the primary investigator, and then they will interview you. They'll see if you're a good fit for the clinical trial, and then you enter the trial. It's super, super easy. I was in 3 clinical trials, so you can be in more than one. I am now in 2 clinical trials, and one of them is one looking at that microbiome health. It's a fiber and cognition trial based out of Stanford University. So I was able to download some apps that I needed to put information in. I go through cognitive testing every 6 months. I keep track of my food. I have a food diary. I also keep track of my exercise. And also every 6 months, I send them samples. And I'm sure you know what samples I'm talking about. And they review them. They look at my samples, they look at my food intake, and they look at my cognitive abilities. And they'll be assessing over time, is there a correlation between gut health and brain health? So, and the other study I'm in is just an app that I play games on. I go through cognitive testing. It's a study based out of Scotland. So I really encourage everybody to take a look at being involved in a clinical trial, especially as women, with us being at a higher risk for developing this disease. I think it's more important than ever to also be involved in how can we change this trajectory? How can we change this outcome? If you are ever interested in learning more, or if you have any questions about research, we do have our wonderful 24-hour helpline, 1-800-272-3900. There's our website, alz.org. There's also a specific website about research if you just want to learn more about some of what I talked about today. And then, of course, the trial match, which I encourage everybody to participate in. So in summary, it's really an exciting time. So much has happened just in the last 7 years. We not only have new tools for detection, but we also have such a diversity now of therapies. I mean, we weren't looking at modifiable risk factors 7 years ago, 10 years ago. There's just so much happening in the research field. And I feel like I can really say that there is hope now, that we are definitely moving in the right direction. Because I'm sure, like all of you, we want to make sure that we get to a point where there is a world without Alzheimer's disease and all other dementias. So I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to hand it over to Jackie. I think we might have some questions. So Jackie?
Yes, thank you so much, Meg, for a very wonderful and informative presentation. I was taking notes over here because there's a couple of new things that I learned. So thank you as always, Meg. So I want to again encourage folks to put questions in the chat. If folks want to use there's a reaction tool where people can raise their hands or to ask a question. We do have a couple of minutes before we have to close out the presentation. Any questions?
So the 4 things in the chat weren't questions.
No, those are resources I was sharing.
Oh, well, make sure you check those resources out then.
Yes. So I see someone, Kara, did you have a
Yes.
question?
Well, I kind of do. So I work with the Alzheimer's Association in development. I also am a caregiver, and my mom is currently moving from moderate to severe Alzheimer's. So I'm wondering, as a woman, who is, getting very close to the 60 mark, what should I do? What should I do? What should I tell my friends? I mean, because here in Kentucky, we're not my caregiver, my primary caregiver is really not prepared for me. They're like, maybe it could be. I don't know. What should I push for?
So are you concerned about your own memory? Is that what-
Yeah, big time.
So you're concerned about your own memory already?
Yeah, a bit.
Okay, so I mean, the first thing is to have that honest conversation with your primary care physician. And if your primary care physician doesn't listen to you, which unfortunately happens, especially when you're younger, people with younger onset have more difficulty actually getting someone to believe them that they have, a memory concern, then it's best to, so you said you volunteer for us?
No, I'm a staff.
You're a staff person. Okay. Hi, Kara.
Nice
From
to meet
Kentucky.
you.
Nice to meet you. So I think we always encourage people to then, talk to your care and support team, and get a second opinion. It's so important with that early detection and diagnosis that when someone is really concerned and they go to their physician and their physician kind of poo-poos it and says, oh, it's normal part of aging, or, oh, you're just stressed or overworked, and
Exactly.
you're really not feeling that that's it. Or, so Kara, you may know Arthena. Do you know Arthena Caston? You don't know. Arthena is younger onset. She's spoken at our summits many times.
I'm a newer staff person.
Okay. So she was experiencing memory issues at 48, and she kept going to her doctor, and her doctor kept telling her it was menopause. Hello, women. Okay.
That
Oh, it's
is so insulting.
it's just
It is
menopause.
so insulting.
So she had to push, and it wasn't until she was 51 that she finally got the diagnosis of younger onset Alzheimer's, and it upset her to no end that she had to fight to get a proper diagnosis and be able to have access to the treatments that are available. So when you have a physician that's not listening to you, and women, if they tell you it's menopausal, it's time to find another doctor. It's time to find someone who's truly going to listen to you for who you are and what your concerns are and take them seriously.
What test should I request?
So they'll probably do like what's called a MOCA or a mini cog, better than the mini mental state exam. The mini mental state exam's a little outdated, but they
Okay.
should also do a total panel, a total blood workup.
Okay.
And I don't know how Lyme disease is down there.
Rampant.
So there is a Lyme related dementia. And I've actually worked with a couple of people where they were misdiagnosed.
Oh,
So ask for the Western blot, which is the blood test specific for Lyme.
okay.
Also, a complete urinalysis should be done. And then some kind of brain scan. So usually physicians won't jump right to a PET scan because of the cost. So a CAT scan or an MRI. And if nothing else, Kara, at least it's a baseline.
Oh, right.
And I think that's what's really important. Say, listen, if it doesn't show anything, at least we have a baseline of what my brain looks like
Right now.
right now, so we can see, are there changes, differences as we
Well,
age.
and that is what we did with the mammograms, right? At 40, we
Exactly.
wanted to
Well,
get that
that's it.
baseline. It was important for us to all have that baseline. So I feel like we should do this now
Yep.
for our brains.
Thank you for
So
the
that's
question.
that's what I would do, and advocate to the hilt. It's unfortunate that, it hit me when I was thinking of my very dear friend Arthena, who she lives in Georgia, and just her frustration of it's menopause, it's menopause, it's menopause. I mean, she just heard that over and over again, and she kept saying it's not. You need to listen to me, and I need to get a proper diagnosis. So advocate the
Frustrating.
heck out of it.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you for the question, Karen. Thank you, Meg. We have one more question that came in through the chat. This
Sure.
came from Janet. The question is, when can or should a person take or use lecanemab? At what stage of the illness?
Great question. Thank you for asking that question. So the newer treatments, Leqembi right now, and hopefully donanemab soon, they are FDA approved for people with mild cognitive impairment or the very early stages of Alzheimer's. So it is, as of now, there has not been shown any benefit for people later in the disease process. With that being said, Leqembi, like I said, I think they have like 3 or 4 trials going on, to be honest with you. I mean, they're really pushing this treatment. So there's a research with Leqembi right now with treatment for tau, but there's also another research study being done with utilizing Leqembi with people in more of the moderate stages of the disease. Right now, though, it's only FDA approved for people with mild cognitive impairment and in the early stages of the disease, which is why early detection is so important. The unfortunate thing about these new treatments is there's such a small percentage of the population that are eligible for it because of not being diagnosed early enough on. So it's really pushing that importance of early detection and diagnosis.
Thank you so much, Meg. And thank you again, everyone, for joining us for today's
Oh,
program.
there's one more question,
Oh,
Jackie.
there is one more. My apologies. Oh, okay. Yes, so the question's coming from Mariana. So if both of your parents have dementia, regardless of your sex, are you at a higher risk? Are there sufficient studies to know the percentage?
That's a very, very good question. So most documented cases of Alzheimer's are what we call sporadic. So we're really not sure why it happens. It's one person in a family that develops the disease. The smaller percentage of cases are what we call familial. So familial Alzheimer's is many people. have been diagnosed. I'll give you an example. I worked with one gentleman whose mother was one of 12 children. And out of 12 children, 10 of them developed Alzheimer's. His mother being one of those 12, one of those 10. And so he knew he was destined to get the disease. There was just no way around it. If you have both parents diagnosed, it would be interesting to know if anybody from another past generation had been diagnosed, like a grandparent or somebody else. If you have one or two people, okay, so you've had many family members that have been diagnosed. So you may have the familial type. If you have many family members that have been diagnosed, I always think it's so important to have that conversation with your physician early on and letting them know that I have Alzheimer's in my family. Is there a way we can start some kind of diagnostic process earlier? Again, get that baseline, but also just to keep an eye on me and how I'm doing. Is Meg a healthcare professional? I'm a social worker with the Alzheimer's Association. So I guess I'm a healthcare professional, but I don't work within the health arena. But oh, how long can someone take donepezil? So this is another question we get asked often, is about medications. So the FDA approves medications for certain stages. So say, I have to go back to my screen. I think Aricept is more early to moderate. And when somebody goes from moderate to severe, usually there's a conversation about medications. Now, most families will have that conversation with the physician, and some physicians will say, listen, if it's not hurting them and you want to keep them on, then that's fine. We can keep them on the medications. Other doctors will say, I don't know how much it's helping this person at this time. It might be time to titrate off. So it really is an individualized conversation that the family needs to have with the physician to determine if the person should stay on the medication or not. But always we try to encourage physicians and families to follow what the FDA has approved those treatments to be used for in what stages.
So we have another comment from Gina. I have a dear friend that are suffering with Alzheimer's dementia, and my husband's father died of dementia. I'm very interested in all and as much information regarding the disease. Thank you for this very vital information. I hope the outreach continues far and wide. Thank you, Gina.
Thank you.
And then another wonderful comment from Susan. Meg, you certainly gave a great presentation. A social worker certainly is a healthcare professional.
Thank
Susan
you.
is a retired nurse practitioner.
Thank you, Susan. Any last minute questions, thoughts? Well, you're very welcome. I hope you found this helpful. As women, I think we have to kind of speak up for ourselves. And when we go to our doctors and they play everything off as menopausal, we need to kind of step up and say, no, I want to have myself checked out. I really think it's more than that.
Thank you so much, Meg. Thank you everyone for joining us today. I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of their evening, well, afternoon, I should say. And again, happy Women's History Month to everyone. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.